Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. After the longest time, or so it feels to me, I am returning to Tetsuya Nakamura's excellent Fire in the Sky, The Great Pacific War 1941 to 1945. And as I promised you all a while previously, sorry, I'm coming back to this game because I found a really short and sweet scenario that some kind soul has put together, and the files that these are based on are available on Board Game Geek. I highly recommend it. Those of you who watched my previous video on this game will remember that I'd played through another fan-made scenario which covered the entirety of the South Pacific campaign from sort of early to end of 1942, beginning of 1943. It was 4 turns long, and it used all of the game's mechanics, so it was quite a nice teaching scenario, and it was a nice short scenario. Well, this one is even shorter at half the length, actually less than half the length, because it's only 2 turns long. I'm going to do some zooming in so you can see what I mean. So here we are at the turn counter. Now this scenario starts on turn 4 and it concludes at the end of turn 5. And it's quicker than just playing 2 turns because certain elements are missed out. Unlike the other scenario, it also uses only a tiny fraction of the map. So if I could come over here, the operational area is basically everything south and east of Palau. The only exception is Kure up in the north, and the only reason Kure is in play is to serve as an arrival point for Japanese reinforcements. So what I might do is generally speaking, as I play through this scenario, I'm going to keep the camera trained on the corner of the map that really matters. But what I want to do is really treat this video as an introduction to this scenario, because certain bits of it need a bit of explanation. I'm not going to linger on the mechanics of the game because I've already covered that in my previous videos, and I would really like this to focus more on the setup in terms of the strategic situation and really the narrative that this very quick scenario can hopefully spin. So before I get on to what everyone's got on the map, let's just look at the all-important logistical bar. So the bits that are missed out in this scenario are the usual calculations of the Japanese merchant totals, as in how many merchant ships they have left, the calculation of their oil points and their transport points. These are predetermined by the scenario. So you see the player starts with a fixed value in terms of oil points and transport points. Similarly, the United States and the Allies, they just get a preset level of transport points. The Japanese get their submarines, the Allies do not. Now, the logic behind this is that although some Allied submarines were operating in theatre, and some of them had some notable successes, including the sinking of the Japanese cruiser Kako, the assumption is that most of them, the assumption is that most of them have been committed to economic warfare, and because this is such a short scenario, economic warfare doesn't figure. So effectively the Allies have no submarines, but the Japanese get their total. The victory point counter is used very differently as well, because there are set victory points for sinking different kinds of enemy vessels, and also for occupying real estate. So the Japanese get a victory point for any Allied base that is not Guadalcanal or Port Moresby. Obviously, those 2 bases are worth a bit more to them if they can take them. And similarly, the Allies are rewarded if they somehow manage to take Rabaul. So both sides have their objectives, which can be quite difficult to achieve. And when you get to the end of the game, you subtract the Allied victory point total from the Japanese. If it's -2 or lower, the Allies win. If it's 2 or greater, the Japanese win. Anything in between that is a tie, so it's pretty straightforward. This game does rely on some optional rules, and I've set some of the counters up within reach over here. The Japanese benefit from Tokyo Express, although unlike the regular rules, they can only use it once in the whole scenario. Ranger to the rescue for the Allied side is essential, so if the Allies have no carriers left in theatre, USS Ranger can be deployed. And I am using the uncontrolled base markers to, and also the occupied base control pending markers. What that does is it slows down the deployment of air units to captured facilities, which is quite realistic. The last one that the Allies should use in this scenario is the gentlemen do not read other people's mail optional rule. And what that allows the Allies to do is once per game, once per scenario in this case, prior to their reaction, they can use their transport points to move naval units within reaction range and then react. It's a significant advantage, and it represents Allied code breaking having an impact at this stage of the war. So much for the broad introduction. What have both sides got? I'm going to start off with what the Japanese have in their home base in Kure. So effectively, these fellows are off map. In this scenario, they have to deploy over there to truck before they can actually do anything useful. But it's no great comfort to the Allied player to know that they have 2 infantry divisions. The light carriers Junyo and Hyo, battleships Kongo and Haruna, and 2 squadrons of Fubuki-class destroyers. The class, of course, doesn't matter so much in this game, but it's nice to know what they've got for flavour. Over at Truck Lagoon, in addition to the there's the aerial garrison there. There's a strength 2 ground unit, fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, light carriers Zuiho and Shoho. Effectively really Zuiho by this stage in the war, but hey, it works. Hiei and Kirishima, the ever-present Tone-class cruisers, some Myokos, more heavy cruisers, and 2 more destroyer flotillas. So a very formidable naval force over there. Neighbouring Palau doesn't have very much, merely an aerial garrison. Over on New Guinea, they have a strength 2 infantry unit. Rabaul is very well stocked. It's the single strongest concentration of Japanese aircraft at the start of the game. Aside from the aircraft carriers, this is land-based air. 1 infantry unit, strength 2, and a fairly powerful force of cruisers and destroyers. It's, the ideal force for the Japanese to play their Tokyo Express counter on. Of course, the Japanese do have reinforcements coming on turn 5, but I'll deal with those when we get to the actual playthrough. Now, the one last thing the Japanese have is it's not represented by a counter in the game, but one of the scenario rules is that the Gilbert Islands are treated as if they have an aerial garrison. The only reason that's there is to impose the air zone of control rules on the Allies as they try and shuttle reinforcements to the decisive theatre, which is really the South Pacific over there. So they have to very slightly deviate around those 2 hexes just to make sure they don't get slowed down. So what have the Allies got? In Port Moresby, all important Port Moresby, there's a thin crust of defenders with the 30th Australian Brigade, Strength 2 ground unit, and one strength point of Allied aircraft. They do have another one in Townsville with the ability to reinforce, but, fairly urgent that you get those up there. The US Marines, of course, have just taken Guadalcanal. So the 1st Marine Division has a somewhat precarious presence there. Down in Espiritu Santo, they have a decent number of aircraft, but again, much more useful if those could be moved to Henderson. And down in Noumea, fairly weak aerial garrison in terms of ground-based aircraft, land-based, I should say. But they have got a fleet there, Saratoga and Enterprise, good mix of heavy cruisers, the beautiful Atlanta-class anti-aircraft cruisers, those are nasty if you happen to be Japanese, and destroyer flotillas, so a pretty decent naval force, crucially within supporting distance of the two major Allied bases, so that's nice. For the purposes of this scenario, Pearl Harbor, rather than the west coast of the US, serves as the home base. So after combat, Japanese ships have to return all the way up to Kure. US ships come back to Pearl Harbor. Now, this is a great thing because coming back to Pearl, they're pretty far away from the scene of the action, but they're not that far away when you think about it. Even allowing for ducking the Gilberts, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 hexes from Pearl Harbor to Guadalcanal means that the fleet can sortie from Pearl during the operational movement phase, and they can still get all the way to Guadalcanal, which is really useful. So what does the US have in Pearl Harbor? Moderately good, 2 strength points worth of aircraft. They've got the 25th Infantry Division, which is not too bad. And more carriers. There's Wasp and Hornet, the battleships North Carolina and Washington, some light cruisers and some destroyers. So not bad, a very decent backing force there. And last but by no means least, holding the line at Samoa, more aircraft and the New Zealanders, a Strength 2 unit. So that is the strategic situation at the start of this scenario. Now, I'd mentioned earlier that quite a bit of it is left out in terms of the logistics of this game. And because of that, the first player turn, the Japanese turn, actually begins with their operational movement phase, so they can commit to operations right away. I hope that gives you an idea about why this is such a great scenario if you're really strapped for time, or you just want to teach a new player the basics of the movement and the combat system. And, the economics can wait for another day. Important though they are, but they're taken care of in this one. The only downside of that, of course, is that your newbie doesn't pick up on all of the different economic steps, which is such an important part of this game. But, fun stuff first. If they enjoy it, then they can do the bean counting another time. So, what are the Japanese options? Being able to go first is, of course, a huge advantage, but it's neatly balanced by the fact that the Allies will know exactly what you're up to. So really, in terms of victory points, let me just find my list. The Japanese get the most victory points for controlling Guadalcanal or Port Moresby. That's 6 victory points each to them. So obviously the two key objectives, if you're Japanese, are those two. They do get points for doing other things, but the next best thing is for sinking enemy carriers. That nets you 3 victory points a throw. So that's pretty much what the Japanese want to do. The question is, how are they going to do it? As ever, their resources are very, very limited. 8 transport points on this turn is really not a lot if you're wanting to shuffle infantry around. Because, I mean, the sheer cost of transportation is pretty high. And the other question they have to deal with is, do they want to open the campaign with the forces they have available in theatre? Or do they want to burn precious transport points, bringing their brethren down from Kure? It's a tough question, and there's probably not always a right answer to it. You know, different strategies work under different circumstances. I think if I were the Japanese player, I would make an early bid to capture one of the key objectives, and I would seize it with the forces that I have in theatre. So the question is, which one? I think, given the ability of the Allies to support Guadalcanal and the fact that Guadalcanal's a much tougher nut to crack in any case, what I would do is launch a fairly massive assault upon Port Moresby. So as it's the operational movement phase, I am just going to grab my handy tables so I remember what the cost of everything is. So this one is easy. Kawaguchi's force is just going to cross the rugged Owen Stanley Mountains and head that way. Now I want to make sure of this place. So, but I don't want to leave Rabaul undefended. So what I'm going to do is pay some transport costs to have Ichiki's unit brought down from truck by sea. So that will cost me 2 transport points. The Japanese total is now 6. And I also want to send some escort with him and his men. So what to do? Don't want to waste carriers escorting a bunch of infantry to their target. We don't have to worry so much about US submarines. So do I want to use destroyers for the cheapness, or do I want bigger things that can offer prospects of shore bombardment? I think, given how urgently we want Port Moresby, I will pay for some battleships to go. So this is going to consume oil points now. So I think Hiei and Kirishima, let's send the Miyokos with them. And one of the destroyer flotillas. So I'll flip these boys to their active side. That was their anchored, that's their active side. And I'll send them to sea as the task force escorting Ichiki's transport. So looking at their their oil costs, that's going to cost me 3.5 oil points. So I have 5.5 oil points remaining. Now, given that the US Navy is lurking in the area and very likely will react to my movement, I feel I have to deploy the carriers as well. I'd be foolish not to. So I'm going to spend even more oil points. Ouch. Sending the carrier force to sea. 4. So if I sent the entire lot, the fleet carriers, the light carriers, the heavy cruisers, and the destroyers, it would cost me a total of another 4.5 oil points. Now this introduces a problem, and it's the question of, do I commit everything knowing full well I won't have enough oil points to react on the Allied turn, or do I keep something back? Very, very tough question. I think I'm not going to risk it this turn. I do want to keep my carrier forces ship shape and ready to go. It does leave those task forces over there horribly, horribly exposed. But I console myself with the thought that I'm committing long-range aircraft to help them. So that should be all right. I hope, as the Japanese player. So there we go. The Japanese have made their operational movement. And the question is, are the Allies going to react? Well, the answer to that is, well, duh. But what are they going to commit is the key question. They can sortie with everything they've got, but the question is, do they want to? Normally, I will tend to play this game rather cautiously, but given the importance of Port Moresby in terms of the victory points, I think I'd be crazy not to. So at the risk of jeopardizing future operations, I'm going to send everything to sea. And I'm going to send 2 task forces. I'm going to group the AA cruisers with my carriers. And I'll give them some destroyers. And as a separate task force, my heavy cruisers can put to sea with destroyers of their own. So it's going to be a bit risky, but I think we do have a significant naval advantage, especially as our carriers are coming to the party. So it's getting rather crowded in that hex now. So that is the Allied reaction movement. Things are getting very, very warm around Port Moresby. And so that brings us to the combat phase. The Japanese have basically just decided that is going to be their big operation for this turn. And I think the Allies are mightily pleased that that's the case. So I'm just going to get out the battle board. Not that I need a reminder, but I like getting into the habit of placing the battle marker. So we have 1 Allied carrier task force, 1 Allied bombardment task force, Japanese bombardment task force with the troops they're escorting. We have a Japanese column marching overland. There's the defenders of Port Moresby along with their aircraft. And there is the Japanese long-range air, 2 groups of it. So the first thing we do is commit submarines. Now, obviously, the US has no submarines to commit to this operation, but the Japanese do. And given the importance of this operation and the number of US ships that are setting sail, they're going to commit both their submarine points for the turn. And they're going to commit 1 submarine point against each American task force. So let's deal with the carriers first. We have one destroyer counter, so we get to roll some anti-submarine warfare, and we'd better hope that we roll a 5 or a 6. No, the Japanese sub gets through. So it lines up on the carriers and hopes it's lucky. Ooh, that's a hit. Okay, very bad news for the US. So rolling on the naval damage check table. Ow. 2 dice. The Japanese got a double 4 for 8. And it's a +2 because it's a submarine attack hit. So if that's equal to or greater than the defense rating, the unit is sunk. Oh no. So the defense rating is, unfortunately for the US, it is equaled. And so those carriers have been lost, and the Japanese get themselves 3 victory points straight away. That is a very unfortunate opening for the US, but a very fortunate one for the Japanese. Now, what about the US surface force? Because that's coming under submarine attack as well. So they're going to roll for their ASW. Oh, and they do terribly again. So the Japanese submarine captain is lining his sights up on a heavy cruiser. But he's not as lucky as his colleague, thankfully for the US. And that is the end of the submarine phase. So now we get to the air phase. The sinking of the US carriers has been extremely fortunate for the Japanese, because it means the Allies now have only a single air point in the area, whereas they have 2, thanks to the amount of aircraft they're committing by way of long-range air. So what we get first is the air-to-air combat phase. The Japanese get 2 dice to 1 allied, so this is not good. They have superiority of numbers. Let's see what it does for them. 5s and 6s needed to hit. Ooh, okay. The Allies have fought harder, driven off one of the Japanese air points, which means that they're tied numerically. Now, what happens in this instance is that you roll off. Despite the Allied success, it's the Japanese who enjoy air superiority. Luck of the dice, unfortunately. So now that air-to-air combat is done with, we go down to the target allocation phase. So the question for the Japanese is, what does their solitary air point want to do? Now, with the loss of the carrier, that distant task force has become a bit of an irrelevance. However,